Hi, everyone. Welcome to the September 4th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona. I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at the wrap-up of some major summer meets at Saratoga and Del Mar. 6-day week this past week at Saratoga, where they ran the Woodward Stakes as the feature, also some important two-year-old stakes, the Spinaway and the Hopeful at Saratoga, as well as the Del Mar Futurity and the Del Mar Debutante at Del Mar. So we'll talk about all of those races. We'll mention some recent maiden winners that were pretty impressive at Saratoga, and then we'll end things by taking a look at some stakes from elsewhere in the country, including a big day at Kentucky Downs, as well as the Parks' prep day for the Pennsylvania Derby card. And at the very end of the podcast, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping, talk about some things that are upcoming and new on the TimeformUS Pacecast. So, Craig, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing good. Like most people, I'm probably taking it a little bit easier with Del Mar and Saratoga finishing up their meet. So we get a brief lull in the action, and I'm sure soon enough we'll be hitting high gear as we head into the Breeders' Cup season.
Yeah, I sort of can't believe it's over. It's just the summer really flew by, as it tends to always do. I just got back to my apartment in Queens yesterday, and I walked in and I looked around and I feel like, wait a minute, I was just here like a week ago. It's almost like the entire summer meet was a dream. But there's still plenty of racing that took place this summer and plenty to still discuss. And I think we could dive right in with the Saratoga races, looking at the Woodward. Preservationist got back on track. He was such an impressive winner of the Suburban back in July. Things just didn't really go right for him in the Whitney. That race was probably a little too tough anyway, with McKinsey being in there, but also he just didn't seem to handle things that well. They managed him a little bit differently in the Woodward, taking him off the pace, and it really seemed to work for him.
It did, and it was a pretty moderate pace. He sat just a couple lengths off of it and was able to outfinish Bal Harbour, who I actually think ran a really good race in defeat. They both got a 125 TimeformUS speed figure. So despite his long odds, it was a pretty formful race figure-wise, as both had run similar figures coming in. Yoshida was probably the disappointment in here. I think he, just didn't get enough pace to run into. Maybe he's just not quite as good as some people seem to think he is. And I thought maybe he was that horse off his last effort with that good second behind McKinsey. But, once again, this older horse group is just, they're sort of so-so compared to prior years. And I brought it up before. The 3-year-olds are running just as fast as everybody not named McKenzie.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the speed figure, because it's a decent number, a 125, which both Preservationist and Bal Harbour earned in this race. It's just not an exceptional number, and it's going to be really interesting heading into the fall as the step up to these older horses. While a fan of Preservationist and Yoshida, they're nice horses, they just aren't really taking that next step forward that you would hope the leaders of this team would. So I know you made that prediction a couple weeks ago that a 3-year-old is going to win the Breeders' Cup Classic this year, and I don't think we've been getting too much to sway you in the other direction.
No, we have. I mean, really, the horse to beat is McKenzie at this point. So I think if you can beat him, there's a pretty good chance it's going to be a 3-year-old. And speed figures are one thing. Some people love them, some people hate them or whatever, but they're a really good predictor when 3-year-olds can step up and compete against older horses and when they can. And this year it looks to me like they can.
Let's talk about the 2-year-old races from Sunday and Monday at Saratoga. Monday's card, the Hopeful, was run over a very sloppy track, as was the theme this summer in Saratoga. We couldn't quite avoid the rain completely that closing weekend, and it really poured late Sunday into Monday throughout the card. Unfortunately, the track conditions caused the scratch of the favorite, Green Light Go. Jimmy Jerkins and the Connections just, I think, decided it would be better to wait for Champagne, assuming he's going on to the Breeders' Cup. I guess they didn't want him over a sloppy track in a race where there were places to go and wait with a developing horse like that. And I would imagine Steve Aston pretty pleased to learn that development, because he had the second through fourth choices in the odds, which then the first through third choices, and they ran 1, 2, 3. They actually ran 3 in the reverse order of their odds, but they just dominated Hopeful. But nobody was any match for Basin. Basin is a horse who had lost his first start. He was that day, came back in what was probably one of the strongest maiden races at Saratoga. Well, not just at Saratoga, we've seen anywhere in the country where Basin beat 3 Technique, who we'll talk about a little bit later in the podcast. But Basin, off that effort, just dominated this hopeful field, really took a nice step forward here.
He did. He ran a 106 off of his 101 last time when he broke his maiden. And though the odds were reversed, this is a time where the speed figures played it out played perfectly as they ran in the exact order of their TimeformUS speed figures. But Basin was much more dominant than the slight edge he had on the numbers coming in. Hard to say if it was a sloppy track. I mean, he's certainly good over a fast track when he broke his maiden, and I imagine this one will be pointed to the Champagne, where maybe he'll meet up with the Scratch Godzilla. And, you know, the 2-year-old is looking pretty deep so far this year.
Yeah, it's funny. We've seen a lot of these first crop sires siring some nice 2-year-olds. And is by Liam Map, and it's going to be interesting to see how these sires like Constitution and Liam's Map, how they're stretch out as we move to the fall, because we've seen a lot of precocity from them so far, more from Constitution. But Basin looks like he definitely has the pedigree to at least get a mile and a 16th. So we'll see what he does here. Godzilla, probably the slight disappointment in this race. He was really hounded by American Butterfly early. I should note American Butterfly was also coming out of that maiden race that was won by Basin earlier in the meet. He was fourth in this hopeful. But I just think Godzilla getting that early pressure really cost him from finishing off the race. And he's probably the one of the 3 Steve Asmussen that I'm a little bit skeptical would be willing to stretch out in the future.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He didn't handle the pressure very well. I mean, he ran third, but he was, you know, pretty far back. And he couldn't hold off Shoplifted, who looked like a horse who didn't really take to the going at all. And he still wasn't able to outfinish him. So I tend to agree with you. Probably more of a sprinter with Zilla.
In the spinaway on Sunday, we saw basically a repeat of the Adirondack. The 2 horses finished first and second in that race, finished first and second in the same order in spinaway. Not that was necessarily expected, though, because I think a lot of people that watched the Adirondack really felt that Frank's Rocket had more trouble. She had sort of just gotten in a difficult spot in between horses, was slammed at about the 3/16 pole in that race, and gamely came through and finished second. But she still finished second to Perfect Alibi, who also had some trouble there. And Perfect Alibi just had her number once again, and was really professional, coming through on the inside through a pretty tight spot to win this race. And Perfect Alibi just seems like the kind of horse that's never going to do anything flashy. She just gets the job done.
Yeah, I'm not sure how far Frank's Rocket wants to go, to be honest, but I'd argue that she may very well have run the best race here, as she was part of what was a really quick pace, while Perfect Alibi was further behind. Our speed figures, we gave her a 109 compared to Perfect Alibi's 105. But I think these are 2 really nice fillies. I know the speed figures are something you want to discuss, but you know, they kind of backed up the Adirondack that they're the best 2 horses in the division, at least on the East Coast.
Yeah, I think it's just worth touching upon the speed figures for this race, because it is an unusual situation where the track may have changed at the end of the day, but it's a little bit unclear. Usually when we've seen at Saratoga the track speed changing significantly, there's been some sort of weather event or track maintenance occurrence during the day. And there has been a lot of weather at Saratoga that's occurred that's caused the track to change throughout the day. We didn't really get that on Spinaway Day. There was a turf race between this race and some others on the card. I think there was one dirt race right before this one adjacent to it. But I know you were explaining this to me, which was really helpful, that the projection for this race, these horses were just running so much slower than what would be expected off of their prior races. And I mean, I guess you could say, did they all just regress? I mean, it's possible. Or was the track just changing at the very end of the day? It's hard to really say, I think. From a visual standpoint, I will say that this race didn't really impress me. It just looked like horses were not finishing this race off. I mean, Figure of Speech finished third and held horses off, even though she was just all over the track and just sort of fighting the rider and shying from the whip, just like she did in her debut. She was really not behaving well in this race. And I don't know. I feel like Frank's Rocket is a horse that has just sort of regressed in every start since her debut. And I know the speed figures don't quite tell that same story. I'm not sure how good these horses are. And I think we'll have to learn in the future.
Yeah, I agree. In that lengthy email I sent to you, which kudos for you taking the time to read it. I'd have probably dumped it after I looked back and saw how long it was. But hopefully it was helpful. And it's just the way I make the figures. I just couldn't see these horses all going backwards significantly. They're the best bred 2-year-olds trained by the best trainers in the land, pointing to a grade 1. So we'll see how it plays out. And that's why we use our question mark code system. You can clearly see there will be a B next to the race rating for this race when these horses run back, telling you it was broken out from the others, and, kind of take it from there. It's not a figure we have 100% confidence in, that's for sure.
Yeah, and just to sort of draw the comparison that I think a lot of people were a little bit confused about is that a 2-year-old maiden race for fillies going the same 7 furlong distance was run just 3 races earlier, and the final time of that race was faster than the spin-away, and obviously our speed figure for that race is significantly lower than the spin-away, and it's a judgment call that needs to be made. Personally, I don't know. I don't have a strong feeling about it. I do think that was a very strong maiden race that we saw earlier in the day. The winner of that race, Alondra, was a rare first-time starter winner for Shug McGahee, who really looked good winning that race, and I think there was some quality behind her. But we'll find out in the future how far these horses want to go and how strong these races really were. The last major dirt race that we'll talk about from this past weekend at Saratoga, that was a stakes event, was the Grade 2 Prioress, which was run earlier on the Saturday card. Break Even was a heavy favorite in this race, and I think she was so impressive in that race on Derby weekend, and she hasn't quite shown that brilliance since then. She's run okay in some of these races, but she just really hasn't been nearly as dominant as she was that day. And I know the track condition might have had something to do with that breakout performance on Derby weekend, and she just really didn't have an excuse here. The pace was it was fast. It wasn't exceptionally fast. It was honest for the distance. And it looked like she had plenty left coming to the quarter pole. Sean Bridgman hadn't asked her yet, but when he set her down, Royal Charlotte was right there, and she just ran right by her. And Royal Charlotte's a solid horse. I don't think she's anything exceptional for this level. Break Even just might not be quite as good as some people thought she was.
Yeah, like you said, maybe it was the condition of the track. Maybe she just regressed off that big effort, but she doesn't quite look the same. She did get a 117 for this, which is still not as good as she has been running earlier. We had talked about her turf race last time where she won, but she didn't she got one of her lower figures. So we thought maybe she didn't handle the turf as well, that she was a better dirt filly, but Royal Charlotte ran okay. She got a decent setup. She only got a 112 as a benefactor of that piece. But the one note I made about this race is how strong the test is already coming back to be. We've already had a few horses come back to win from that. And we're talking about horses who were well beaten in the test. We'll talk about Geltrin later and Royal Charlotte here. So not surprising that the test is a strong race. But I think we're going to find out it was exceptionally strong.
One thing I do just want to ask about in relation to the Prioress of the dirt races on Saturday is that the track is color-coded bright blue for the bias situation on Saturday, indicating that it was a track that strongly favored closers as just the trend throughout the day. And I was looking through the results, and I see where that comes from. I mean, we did have a couple strong favorites not going wire to wire, and a lot of horses coming from off the pace to win. In situations like that, I often like to look to see if there was some underlying reason, if there was a path bias, if the rail was bad. I didn't really see any of that. It might have just been a situation where a trend developed without any clear reason why.
Yeah, I agree with that. I always say when you see these color codes, take a look in our charts, which depending on the subscription you have with TimeformUS, I'm not sure how the access works for that. I know depending on the plan, you get certain levels, but I know I use the charts all the time. And I quickly looked at that one. I did plan on going back this week to see what I thought, because I don't remember the rail being particularly bad or anything like that. And it just looked like a day where maybe the closers happened to be the best horses in the race.
Yeah, that's sort of how I felt, even though the races might not have been bet that way. And that would be taken into consideration when you're making those bias determinations. Let's move away from the dirt and talk about some of the turf races from this past weekend at Saratoga. On closing Monday, they ran the Bernard Baruch. Corbin, this is really the only race he wants to win. He came over to this country last year and won a pretty lucky bob in the 2018 version of the Bernard Baruch. And ever since then, he's been this horse that's run well in basically every race that he's participated. He just can't seem to find the wire first again, well, until Monday. And he won the Bernard Baruch again in much more dominant fashion this year. Looking through the PPs of the horses, he was just far and away the class of the field. The real question mark was, would he want to win a race? And it turns out he did on this day. He's a pretty good horse. I just don't really know where they go from here with him.
Yeah, he got a 129, which is a really nice TimeformUS speed figure, particularly on turf. But I think maybe the course condition had something to do with that. It was a slow pace. I'm pretty sure it was a bog. I haven't looked at what our race rating was. I don't remember the variant off the top of my head that I used, but it obviously was a slow course. All the other turf races were taken off that day. And he was able to wear down the leaders. And interesting to note, the 1-2 horses early ran second and third. So nobody was really making up a lot of ground. But if anybody did, it was him. And he was actually pulling away late. So good effort. How much of it was the course, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's hard to know how slow the course really was, because I think they did overcompensate a little bit by going way too slow in the early going, which, as we were saying, it did favor the horses that were up close to the pace, the horses that were running in the first three positions early. I mean, they did run that fourth quarter from the 6 furlong pole to the mile in just over 23 seconds. So I don't think it was that boggy, because that's a respectable fraction. It's not, the kind of fractions we're seeing on those rock hard turf courses from earlier in the summer. But I don't think it's totally surprising that Corbin could run a figure like 129, because he'd been competitive with a horse like Bricks and Mortar earlier in the year. I mean, he's a really good horse. It's just unclear what his best distance is, unclear if he can always show up with this kind of effort and have that will to win races. I guess they'll point to a race like the Breeders' Cup Mile off a performance like this. We'll see if he can develop a little more consistency in terms of actually winning races. But he did perform pretty well on this day. Earlier on the Saturday card, before the Woodward, they ran the Glens Falls, where Mississippi, funny play on, what do you call that? I don't know. I'm forgetting the word for that. But she, coming over from Europe for the first time for Graham Motion, won the Glens Falls from well off the pace. She's a horse who had pretty terrible form coming over from Europe. She had been a pretty capable 3-year-old running well in some nice races, but more recently, her form had just completely fallen apart. Sometimes horses like that, they need firmer turf, they need Lasix. Both of those might have been the situation with Mississippi, and she just really took to U.S. racing.
She did. This was a horse I actually liked, just because I'm just not impressed with any of the others in this field. It feels like the Grade 1 fillies and mares are a really strong group, but then when we drop below that, it seems like a significant step down. You don't get a lot of horses moving back and forth between them, and the ones who hadn't had any success at Grade 1. So I just wasn't impressed with anybody in here, and took a shot with her that maybe it was Lasix, and Graham Motion does well with shippers, and she backed it up. She ran a nice 119, which, as you said, her form had been horrible. So maybe it was the Lasix. It's really hard to say, because we don't get that kind of information here, but I thought it was a solid effort. She looked like a winner every step of the way to me. It was just a matter of if she was going to get out or not. She was kind of pinned in. She moved a little early. Now, not as early as race favorite Santa Monica, who made a big, wide, sweeping move, probably premature. But, I'm not saying it was the wrong thing to do. She kind of was left without many options at the point. But maybe she should have been second in this race. But I think the winner was clearly best.
Mississippi's name is a homonym. I lost my vocabulary for a second. Yeah, I agree with that. That ride on Santa Monica was a little perplexing. I guess they were concerned about the pace, and she had sort of been a victim of pace in this very race last year when Lady Montour wired the field. And it seemed like they were a little bit concerned about not letting them get the jump on her coming around the far turn. But you sacrifice so much ground going wide and making that premature move, whereas Mississippi just saved all the ground on the inside under a great ride from Joel Rosario. So I think that really made the difference. I would say, though, I don't think Santa Monica is quite the same horse that she was last year. And I just haven't been impressed with her. Even though she's won a few races, I just haven't really been generally impressed with her performances this year. And as a 6-year-old, I feel like she might be starting to head in the wrong direction. We'll talk about the 3-year-old race, which I think was the final stakes race to talk about from Saturday's card, the Grade 3 Saranac, going a mile and 16th on the turf course. not a big field, scratched from 6 down to 5 horses. Global Access for Mike Trombetta, been kind of knocking on the door for a little while in these bigger races. Got the job done here. I thought he ran pretty well. He was about 4 wide around the far turn, chasing Good Governance, who was the heavily bet favorite in this race off just a maiden victory in his debut. Looked like Good Governance was home free coming to about mid-stretch, but Global Access just sort of tracked him down and gamely beat him.
He did. And I think this was a case where, as great a trainer as Chad Brown is, I think you've pointed out before, he's just getting overbet so bad at this meet. And I think this was one of these cases. I'm not saying Good Governance couldn't have won the race. Certainly he could have, but 3-5 seemed a little bit ridiculous. He came in with a 106 TimeformUS speed figure. The winner came in off of 111. So he had a gap to close there. And really, I think Global Access proved he was best. He was further behind a pretty slow pace. We have the opening quarter coated in blue, and he was wide, and he was still able to run him down. So pretty closely matched. Both the top two got 111s. Even the third place runner, Seismic Wave, got a 109. But, it was a grade 3 race, and that's about a grade 3 figure for 3-year-olds this time of year. And, I don't think we have any stars here, but solid enough horses.
Yeah, we've been seeing all of these graded stakes for the 3-year-old turf horses, just sort of earning the same speed figures in that, 110 to 116 range, and nobody's really breaking out and distinguishing themselves. We'll talk about the Jockey Club Derby, which is coming up as the final leg of this series in recent weeks, but that's kind of been the theme of the horses participating in that race. And we saw it again in the Saranac. Seismic Wave was probably a little bit unlucky. Joel Rosario gave a great ride in the Glens Falls. His ride in this Saranac was probably not ideal because Seismic Wave is a horse that sort of has to make that one closing run and wind up and gather momentum. And he just kind of stuck him down on the rail heading into the far turn. The pace was collapsing in front of him with that longer shot in the field down inside that he was stuck behind and had to slam on the brakes, alter course. He was finishing best of all at the end. Would he would have won the race? I don't really know. He's a horse that's sort of had his chances and disappointed before, but just not the ideal scenario for him.
Yeah. One point I want to make, you mentioned the long shot was setting a pace. That is something you want to pay attention to with these color-coded fractions. This one we had the quarter slow, but if you look, it was, horses setting the pace that probably weren't really contenders in here. So it's probably not as important as it would be in another race where, if you had a 3-5 or the 2-1 second choice setting the pace, it would be a lot tougher to run down.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The final turf race we'll talk about from Saratoga was the Lucky Coin, which was run on Friday. Unfortunately, this race was pretty significantly affected by scratches. The field that was originally drawn, I believe, had 9 runners in it with plenty of speed signed on. Disco Partner was a standout based on past performances, but then I think 4 horses scratched out, and it was just a 5-horse field with not nearly as much speed as there initially seemed to be. And I think that worked against the favorite in this race, Disco Partner. I also think Disco Partner has just lost a step. I think that's been confirmed at this point. I was hoping otherwise earlier in the year when I liked him on Belmont Day, but he was beaten by World of Trouble there, beaten by Leinster earlier in the Saratoga meet, and just seems like Disco Partner, not quite the same horse that he once was. But the winner of this race, Shecky Shabazz, he's in career form. He surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly to everybody, because I think he was only about 7-1. He won a $25,000 claimer as a bit of an upset earlier in the year in the meet, going 5.5 furlongs for trainer Adam Rice. He was a private purchase out of that race by Michael Dubb, given to Jason Service. And unsurprisingly, he takes another step forward and wins this stakes race. Now he's 2 for 2 on the turf, obviously a capable turf sprinter, but he did really have everything his own way on the front end.
He did. You don't often see in a race like this a 108 first quarter TimeformUS pace figure, which was coded in blue. And basically at that point, the race was over. Nobody was going to run this horse down in the last 3 furlongs when not only did he run a 108, he was clear. So, it's hard to say how good he is at this point. It's Jason Service. So who knows how high he can take him. 5 furlongs is what they're going to run the Breeders' Cup at. So I have no idea if this horse is nominated, but he would certainly be a factor, at least a pace presence in a race like that. So I'll just be looking to see where he shows up next. And probably want to take him on based on the fact he's probably not going to see circumstances that beneficial again against better horses. But, sir, a good effort.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't really know what to do with this horse moving forward because I don't think this was a truly run race. But he's done nothing wrong on the turf so far, so we'll see what these connections can do with him because they've done some nice things with other horses in the barn. We'll finish up the Saratoga meet by mentioning 3 maiden races that took place this past week. I think the one that caught a lot of people's attention on Saturday's card was 3 Technique, who was making his 3rd start. He had finished 2nd in both of his starts earlier in the year, one at Belmont and one at Saratoga, the most recent of which was a 2nd place finish to the hopeful winner Basin. And 3 Technique was rightly bet down to favoritism in this race. Looked pretty dicey coming around the far turn because he's not a horse with a ton of speed, and he was sort of caught in some traffic at the back of the pack. They had to just gradually work him off the inside. But once this horse found a clear path at the quarter pole, I mean, he just lowered his head and kicked it into high gear and finished off this race the way that you want to see a 2-year-old finishing.
Yeah, I was going to say this was as visually impressive a race as you're going to see from a 2-year-old. I kind of wrote him off at the top of the stretch. I didn't think he was going to do anything, and he just kicked it in and blew by him like they were standing still. He got a 101 TimeformUS speed figure, which, isn't anything spectacular at this time of year, but I think the visual and the trouble that he had kind of indicates he's a horse with some real talent, and I expect him to stretch out, and it looks like he'll be able to do it just fine.
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit in relation to the Spinaway and the Hopeful and the speed figures all these races are getting. As a trend over the past number of years, as these 2-year-olds are debuting a little bit later in the season, I think we started to see a real rise in the quality in the maiden races, especially at meets like Saratoga and Del Mar, and just a little bit of a dip in the quality in the graded stakes races. I mean, just look at the Sanford and the Schuylerville that they ran earlier in the meet at Saratoga. I mean, those horses just aren't very good, it turns out, compared to the subsequent maiden winners that we've seen. And I just think we see some pretty strong performances in these maiden races. And I'm saying that because 3 Technique, they probably could have taken a shot in the Hopeful and done pretty well there. He might not have won, but I think there's no doubt he would have at least been 2nd in that race with a performance like this. I assume the Champagne will be next for him. Jeremiah Engelhardt has had just an amazing meet with the 2-year-olds at Saratoga, debut winners, 2nd out winners, 3rd out winners. He's got some bullets to fire moving forward as all of them face winners. But 3 Technique, he might be the best of all of them. He looks pretty special for this barn.
Yeah, I think I heard him say on the last day watching the Fox broadcast, he had 9 2-year-old winners 9 different 2-year-old winners during the Saratoga meet. And I mean, this is a guy I just don't remember that from in years past. So he seems to be getting better stock into his barn. He used to deal with a lot of claiming horses and still does, but he's obviously a very good trainer and finally starting to get some really good horses that can run.
Another 2-year-old that was pretty impressive on Monday's card, that sloppy track that we had on closing day at Saratoga, was Gouverneur Morris for Todd Pletcher. Watching all of the workouts as I make these morning lines throughout the summer at Saratoga, you see a lot of these Pletcher and Chad Brown horses working in company with each other. And the 2 in Pletcher's barn is the 2-year-olds that really stood out. One was obviously that Candy Tycoon, who just really disappointed with a poor start in his debut. I assume we'll see him again at Belmont at a pretty short price in a maiden race. But the other one that had really impressed in the mornings was Gouverneur Morris, and he did not disappoint in his debut. Unlike some of the other ones for this barn, he broke just fine. Got into a pretty good tracking position in behind 2 speeds, really just the perfect trip for a first-time starter. And he just easily took over in the stretch and drew off with the big strides, only going 5.5 furlongs, but he finished up the way that you want to see a horse doing it. He's bred to go longer. This one's probably pretty good.
Yeah, no doubt. He got a 96 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort, but I think it's personally pretty irrelevant. The final time was 100. The pace was slow in here. We have it all coded in blue, but he was able to rate off of that slow pace, which is always a good sign, and just inhale this field and win as easy as a horse could. So when he comes back, he's not one, despite he'll come in with inferior speed figures, but he's not one that I'm going to be against when he steps in next. I assume he'll go in the Champagne as well.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say about the race is that it didn't feel like there was a ton of quality behind him in the fields. There just weren't really any stories on the other horses, and I don't think any of them ran particularly well. But when you're winning by about 8 lengths, I don't think that matters that much. And I think the same holds true for the last maiden race we're going to discuss. Actually, a 3-year-old maiden race, not a 2-year-old race. Indian Pride won her belated debut on Wednesday at Saratoga, which was just a week ago at this point. It feels like ages ago. And this is a filly that I had actually been super aware of for well over a year, because I remember as I was making these morning lines at Saratoga last year, just sort of try to sort out all of these Chad Brown first-time starters that were 2-year-olds and determine which ones were the well-meant ones and which ones just weren't that good. And I remember seeing this horse, Indian Pride, who was just outworking everything in Chad Brown's barn in the morning, outworking the horses that won, outworking stakes horses, and I put her in my stable mail just thinking, I guess she's going to show up at Belmont and just destroy a field of maidens. And then she just disappeared and we never heard from her again. She resurfaced on the work tab this summer, looked to be working great again. And the word was out on her because I think she went off as the odds-on favorite in here. And boy, was she impressive.
Yeah, she was. And this is one, I missed when I did the initial rundown because I'm usually looking for 2-year-old maidens. That's what I put into my search. And I totally forgot, but I watched this race live, and she blew me away. She got a 112 TimeformUS speed figure in her debut here, and probably could have been easier. Could have been higher. I hate to say that because you never really know, but she's a horse who looked like she could definitely run faster. She had this field over a barrel, put him away, and was just cantering home late, and just a really impressive looking horse. You'd like to know the story, what kept her away from the races, but in the hands of Chad Brown, who's proven he can be as patient as anybody and bring horses out running, as we've seen with his 2 turf horses, Annals of Time and Bricks and Mortar. So I have no doubt that this filly is going to make some noise in the division.
Yeah, I don't know what the plan is with her. I don't know how far she wants to go. Maybe she's just a pure sprinter. But wherever she shows up, I think she's going to be pretty dangerous because she was really impressive in this race. And it's no secret that she has been known for a while to have a lot of ability. That's the Saratoga meet. Let's move on to Del Mar and wrap up the action out there. Beginning with the male version of the 2 major 2-year-old races, the Del Mar Futurity. Now, I know we had talked about the spin away coming up, sort of a slow race and not knowing what to do with it, just looking at the raw time of the race compared to the rest of the day. The same was true with the Del Mar Futurity, except different kind of situation because there's a pretty clear reason why this race came up so slow.
Yeah, the favorite broke and ducked into that chute, coming out of that 7-furlong chute, lost the rider, caused another horse to lose the rider. And on top of that, they were just going really fast. Usually when you see an incident like that, the jockeys tend to be cautious and the pace gets slow. But it was the complete opposite in this case. I don't have the official figure yet. I did discuss it with my assistant who does the California. He's actually out there in L.A., and, it's just a slow race. You can look at the circumstances pretty easily and see why. But the winner, Nucky's, only going to get a 92 or so for this race. The final time was actually basically a pitiful 83 for what's supposed to be a grade 1 race. How much you want to give to the incident and how much is the horses just not being that great, the ones that actually finished? I'll leave that up to the handicappers out there.
Yeah, I would imagine, I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, but I would imagine this would be one of the lowest grade 1 speed figures we've ever given out. I can't think of too many lower than this, even for the 2-year-old races, especially that final time figure in the 80s. I don't think I've ever seen that before in a grade 1 race. Yeah, I mean, I will say, looking through the PPs of these horses before the race, it did seem like it was just 8 rings and everybody else. I mean, he was 1-2 for a reason. And also one of his main rivals was the horse that he took out on his inside, Storm the Court, another impressive debut winner. So, yeah, I just think there wasn't a whole lot left in this race without those 2 horses participating. And, yeah, I don't know what to say about the top 2. I mean, good for Peter Miller to win those, to get first and second in this race. I'm just not sure what it really means. I will say, not to just harp on a horse that didn't really participate, I still think 8 Rings is a really nice horse. I don't want to put any stock in the fact that he ran loose and got up for third in this race, because I don't think stuff like that matters at all. He was carried no weight. But that debut performance, it's been only flattered in retrospect as we look back, as horses have come back out of that race. So I still think 8 Rings is a really nice horse, and hopefully, as long as he's sound and everything, we'll see him in some major stakes moving forward. I just don't have a whole lot to say about the horses that actually completed the race.
No, I would agree with that. And the one horse I would probably think still has some talent is Ginobili. He had broke his maiden race really impressive with a 108. But he was a horse who really wasn't pointed for this race. It was kind of a last-second decision, and he came back pretty quick for a 2-year-old. So that's one I'd be willing to write off and see what's going to come up with him. He was part of that hot pace, made a move, and then fell apart. So of the others in here, he's the one I'd want to see back.
Now, we did see a pretty impressive performance in the Philly version of the race, the Del Mar debutante run on Saturday, as Bast for Bob Baffert. She broke her maiden here, but it wasn't the kind of situation where you're disappointed to see a horse breaking their maiden in a grade 1, because she had run really well in her debut. It was probably just a little unfortunate to debut in one of the most loaded maiden races of the entire Del Mar meet. She was second to Inspiressa that day, who was actually the favorite in this Del Mar debutante. But I think the added distance really made the difference between these two, because Inspiressa just looked like she hit a wall at the quarter pole, whereas Bass was just hitting her best stride at that point, and she really looked good, loving her head and finishing off this race, moving like a typical Uncle Mo. They don't seem to have any trouble getting at least a mile, and I think Bob Baffert has a pretty nice filly on his hands with Bast.
Yeah, he does. I remember commenting on Twitter after her last race that this was a horse that wanted longer, and I was pretty impressed with her race at 5.5, and boy, did she look good. I think she moved probably right to the top of the division. I know we already talked about the spin away, but in a head-to-head matchup going longer, I'd probably want Bast over these guys and gals, I should say. Really good effort. I think Inspiressa is probably a horse that's going to be a sprinter. You mentioned the fact that she hit the wall. I don't really think she's bred to go all that long, but Bast looks like a filly with a real future.
Yeah, Bast is one of these rare horses that has almost an obscene amount of inbreeding, but it seems to be working for her. Both her sire, Uncle Mo, his dam sire is Arch, and Bast's dam sire is Arch. So she's very closely related to Arch. I think we also see that in Enable's pedigree. I think she's got that same inbreeding to Galileo. So it works for some of these horses. And Bast, she looks like a pretty good one. And with the Breeders' Cup being out in California this year, I definitely think she's got the advantage over the East Coast horses who just haven't really impressed thus far. We'll see what they do as we move into the fall. But I don't think Bast is going to have any trouble stretching out in distance as they try 2 turns in a race like the Chandelier at Santa Anita. A couple of turf stakes races at Del Mar, the Del Mar Derby, kind of continuing with this theme of 3-year-old turf horses not really distinguishing themselves. Again, this race got the exact same TimeformUS speed figure as the Saranac, as Nolde for John Sheriffs got the job done here. Obviously a horse that likes the turf. He's just, I think, a nose away from being 4 for 4 on this surface. Don't know how strong this race was overall. Got a good trip and ride. Just okay horses, nothing exceptional.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this one. No, they got a 111 TimeformUS figure, as you mentioned. Just pretty much what we keep seeing. I mean, we see some of the 3-year-olds back in New York were running 115s or so. So I think they're a little bit better group, but it's the time is coming where they got to face olders, and I'm not sure where any of these horses we're seeing are going to fit in without some major improvement.
Yeah, the horse who was second here, a Jeff Mullins trainee, whose name is escaping me right now, he had run on some East Coast for stakes races earlier in the year, I think at Keeneland and some other venues, and had, I think, failed to hit the board in any of them. And he was just coming off an allowance win most recently. So I just didn't think there was a whole lot of quality in this field. And we were saying the same thing about the La Jolla that Kingley had won earlier. Kingley just got a little too rank in this race and couldn't finish it off. I just feel like these aren't quite as good as the East Coast horses, and none of them are really that good in this division right now. We did see some quality, though, in the John C. Mabie Grade 2 event for the fillies and mares, as Vasilika got back on track. She's kicking off another winning streak. She's had many in the past, and she avenged her loss from last time. I think maybe reuniting with Flavien Prat had something to do with it. Not that Julien Leparoux made a huge mistake last time, just probably not the ideal trip for her in that previous race. And she ran really well because the runner-up in here, Juliet Foxtrot for Brad Cox, who had shipped to the West Coast for this race, was 3 for 3 in the U.S. coming into this, and she looks like a pretty talented horse. And Vasilika just gamely ran her down.
Yeah, she did. I wasn't sure who got up. I'm usually pretty good at calling those photos, but I couldn't tell this one. And if I had to bet, I'd have probably been wrong because I thought Juliet Foxtrot might have hung on. But this was a really quality grade 2 for fillies and mares. The winner and the third place finisher, Toinette, got 119s, and Juliet Foxtrot actually got a 121 for being a part of that fast pace. Not fast to be coded in red, but fast enough, a good solid pace. And Vasilika just ran her down. She proved what a game filly she is, got back on the winning track, and I'm sure we'll see her in the Breeders' Cup. I don't think these are horses that can handle the Chad Brown contingent back east, but they are certainly a solid group of grade 2 fillies.
Yeah, I agree with that. Vasilika, I know she's one of the horses that you've become a big fan of, and she's just a really cool hard trier who shows up every time, and it's pretty cool to see her winning these races still as she gets up there in years. But I agree. Strong group. Toinette, I was impressed with her too, even though she only finished third in this race. She was coming off that really impressive allowance victory that we had talked about, and I think this is actually a decent group of turf horses out in California. We'll go to some other venues before we wrap up the show. And beginning with Kentucky Downs, one of the races, many races that they ran with a gigantic purse this past opening day for them on Saturday was the Tourist Mile, which I believe was worth something like $750,000. Snapper Sinclair got the win in here. I have trouble analyzing these races at Kentucky Downs, as I'm sure you do, because I'm not sure what the fractional times mean. I'm not sure even how reliable they are. The race flows are sometimes hard to predict. Something happened on the backstretch here that I couldn't quite get a handle on, where it looked like Snapper Sinclair had to steady, sort of lost a couple lengths of position, but it came around, never really looked like a winner until the very end of the race when things just sort of fell apart and he ran by everybody.
Yeah, as far as the figures, he got a 119 for the win. He's a horse that he had actually won on turf a couple times back. He had to scroll way back in his PPs. He won his second and third starts of his life on turf. But as far as figures go, I consider this track almost like Los Al when they run the thoroughbred meet there, that it's kind of in its own little world. When these horses show up somewhere else, I'll basically put a line through this. I'm not going to put a lot of stock into it with Snappy Sinclair. I don't think he's going to go on to win a graded stakes at Keeneland on the turf for sure, but it was worth a lot of money. The one thing I did notice, as you said, was the odd-looking running line where he went from 3.5 lengths back at one call to 9 back at the next. I do want to go watch the replay and see just how accurate that is. I know he had some trouble, but that seems pretty extreme. But it was a decent effort. The one thing I will point out is that the fractional times there are all hand timed, and anybody who's seen the course layout there can imagine what it must be like trying to hit a stopwatch at just the right time. So I don't even try to make pace figures for there. They're impossible. The hand time fractions are bad. The final times are good. They actually use the photo finish system and they time from the gate there. So I'm pretty comfortable in that with the final time figures. You just have to keep in mind that pace can have a big influence on turf numbers, so they won't always go straight by the final time. There's going to be plenty of times where the figures are broken out, but we're just using final time numbers here.
Yeah, that's good to know. I think make a clarification about the paces of these races, because sometimes the race flows is what you really have to pay attention to. And this one just really collapsed at the end, although the horse who was setting the pace, Real Story, he did hang on for second here, and he had led for most of the way. So I guess he ran pretty well. Yeah, these Kentucky Downs races, I feel pretty much the same way, especially this year. Some of these races just have gigantic purses. While they're competitive fields, I'm not sure the quality of the fields really matches the purse structure, but I'm sure they're fun races to wager on and handicap. Even if the results can be a little hard to predict at times, they're pretty big fields. Moving on to Monmouth, unfortunately, we did not see a big field in the Red Bank, which was run earlier this weekend, I want to say on Sunday. So it was good to see Desidero get another win. The win's been pretty infrequent for him the past couple of seasons. I believe this was just the second time he crossed the wire in front since he was a Grade 1 winner in the Turf Classic at Churchill Downs a number of years ago. Just sort of fell into this victory, though. He was the class of this field. I know he wasn't favored in this race. They bet another horse for a reason that I can't really I'm not really sure why Fiery Speech was even money in this race against Desidero. But Desidero got a good trip, took it over at about the 8th pole, and there was just nobody there to really come back at him at the end, because he's a horse that sometimes has a tendency to hang on the money, not finish off his races after getting the lead too early. But there was just nobody to take advantage of that situation in this Red Bank.
No, yeah, I thought he ran well here. He got a 125, which is kind of where he tops out on his best races. He overcame a slow pace. And to your point, he did kind of hang a little after he made the lead. When he engaged the leader, it looked like he was going to go by and win by 5, but he still had plenty to hold on. Fiery Speech is a nice enough horse. He had come in off 2 wins with 120 and 116 TimeformUS speed figures. So I guess I can see the public support, but I was really surprised, like you were, that he was favored over Desidero, just seeing the class races that horse has run well in.
Yeah, I agree with that. Another classy older horse that winning on the turf took place at Parks on Monday as Pure Sensation, a horse that we've talked about a few times before on the podcast. Just really admirable 8-year-old who just is still firing off top efforts at this point in his career. He loves Parks. He loves turf courses with a little bit of give to them. I know this turf course at Parks was rated firm. It looked like they were kicking up some clods watching the replay. So sometimes these turf courses later in the summer or into the fall, they're not quite as firm as you might expect. But Pure Sensation loves that. And they tried to make things difficult on him. A horse, a long shot, ranged up outside of him around the far turn, made things a little tight. But once they got into the stretch, Pure Sensation just kicked away and won by open lengths, as he always seems to do at Parks.
Yeah, he did. He did have to survive an inquiry here as he kind of took out some horses at the start. And I don't mean right at the start like a Byron start, but, maybe 50 yards into the race, he came over and caused some traffic. And it was actually a pretty lengthy inquiry, but as easy as he won, I think the stewards probably made the right call here. He's a horse who, you said, just loves Parks. He's solid enough everywhere else, but he's now 7 out of 8 at Parks going this 5 furlong distance with 1/3. And if I remember right, that third was a pretty troubled trip. I'd have to look back and watch the replay. But, he's a horse. If he shows up in the Breeders' Cup, I'm going to be against him until they run a Breeders' Cup at Parks, which probably won't happen in my lifetime. But he's just a really quality horse. I love the horse. He's an 8-year-old gelding, so I imagine he's not going anywhere anytime soon. And I think he's won this race 4 years in a row. So I imagine he'll try again for 5 next year as all goes well.
I mean, the one thing I will say about Pure Sensation is that he might just be one of those 5 furlong specialists. And he only really gets to do it at Parks because a lot of the other courses he runs at, they don't have that configuration. They run the 5.5, the 6. He hasn't run at Gulfstream that much, I don't believe, or at least he just gets his season started there. There are too many big turf stakes at Gulfstream for him, especially through the middle of the year. So maybe the Breeders' Cup being at 5 furlongs is really going to work out for him. I kind of forget how he ran in the Del Mar race. I want to say he ran pretty well in there, but I'm not remembering exactly. He's an admirable horse. We'll see how he does against the top horses in the country. If World of Trouble comes back, I think it's going to be tough for a horse like Pure Sensation, but I'm a fan and I admire what he does.
Yeah, at Del Mar, he actually set the pace for a long way before being beaten a little over a length. At 5 furlongs, he's 11 out of 19 overall now compared to his 7 out of 8 at Park. So he can win at the distance, but at other places, but certainly not as good as at Park.
No, I agree with that. Definitely his preference. Couple of dirt stakes races for the 3-year-olds to wrap things up at Parks. These are local preps for the Cotillion and the Pennsylvania Derby, beginning with the male version, the Grade 3 Smarty Jones. This was a pretty exciting race to watch as spun to run, coming around the far turn, or even early in the race. Paco Lopez just had a fistful of horse. I mean, he could hardly get this horse to rate in behind runners. And coming around the far turn, it almost looked like he was trying to get him in some trouble just so the horse wouldn't move too soon, and sort of put him in this tight spot in between horses. And he eventually came through there when he found a gap. But Gray Magician, who was behind him early, just sort of looped around those horses, avoiding any of those potential traffic issues. And it looked for a long while like Gray Magician had just gotten the jump on Spun to Run, but as he had traveled so strongly early in the race, he still had something in reserve in that final 16th, and he was able to come back for the win.
Yeah, it was a really game effort. I'd even fooled the track announcer a bit. He thought Gray Magician was going to go right by, but, Spun to Run really dug in, and he's been impressive since he came back from a layoff in March. He had broke his maiden easily, then won an allowance race even easier, and then he was, off for a better part of 4 months before showing up in the Haskell. And if anything, he kind of flattered those top two, Maximum Security and Mucho Gusto, because he was way back in third that day and still got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure, which he basically matched in this effort. So I don't think we saw top tier 3-year-olds. These ones are clearly a cut below. If any of them show up in the Pennsylvania Derby, they're going to have their work cut out for them and probably be over their heads. But a solid effort for what it was, a grade 3 for 3-year-olds this time of year. It's a respectable number.
Yeah, I agree with that. And Parks can sometimes be a bit of a quirky surface. So he does have that home court advantage. We'll see if that plays in at all. But I agree with you about the quality of this race compared to some of the other 3-year-olds that are likely to show up in the Pennsylvania Derby in a few weeks. Quite the effort that we saw in the filly version of this race from Geltrin. This was the Catherine Sophia. I don't really know where this effort came from because Geltrin, she had run some decent races in the past. She hadn't quite shown herself to be at that grade 1 or grade 2 level against the top horses in the country. But this was a real breakout performance from her. It did help a little bit that the 3 to 5 favorite Fashion Faux Pas, something clearly went wrong with her on the far turn. It looked like she might have went wrong, and then they continued on, and then they pulled her up. I don't know what the story was there. But with her out of the race, it became a lot easier. Geltrin still put forth quite the performance to win. A 120 TimeformUS speed figure for 3-year-old fillies is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I don't know where this one came from either. She's another one that ran in the test. She ran 5th that day. Was never really in the race, as was none of the fillies were, other than the top 2. But this was a big effort. We do give this the O. It wasn't the only route on the day, but it was the only route with a fast track. They had some weather issues, so I kind of flagged it, but I didn't really have any problem with the figure here. If you go and watch the race and watch the replay, she looks really good. She sets a contested but solid pace, and when they turn for home, she just absolutely blows this field away. And there were some pretty decent fillies behind her. The figures that they ran, they make sense. So I don't have any problem with this 120. It was a big effort from her, and maybe running on the front's what she needs. She certainly isn't going to be able to do that in sprints, but stretching out, maybe that'll be her thing.
Yeah, I don't think she's necessarily going to beat Guarana in the cotillion, but I suppose a speed figure like this puts her in the conversation where she was not before. And she handles Parks, which is a feather in her cap going into a race like that. But I think she's the kind of horse that's going to have to back this effort up because seems like a bit of a fluke. But these 3-year-old fillies, they can improve pretty quickly as we get into the fall. I just want to see it again from Geltrin, as I'm sure that you would. Let's end the podcast by talking about some new things that are coming up on the TimeformUS Pacecast. First of all, I should just mention there's not going to be a show next week. I'm taking a little vacation after the Saratoga meet, some time off. So we'll probably, on the next recap show, we'll maybe look at some stakes from prior 2 weeks, including the big card at Belmont this Saturday, the Jockey Club Derby and the Jockey Club Oaks. But no podcast next week. But when we do begin again in 2 weeks, we're going to have something new where we actually add a second podcast each week. And it's going to be a preview show. I know some people have requested this in the past. So I believe it's going to be every Friday. And Craig and I are going to take an early look at some stakes races for each weekend.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. It's, a lot of times it's easy to sit back here and armchair quarterback after the race, and it'll be good to put our opinions out there before the race. I know you do it all the time on the NIRA site and on the TimeformUS site, and have pretty good following. I do it from time to time on the big race days and on Twitter. I'm not afraid to put my opinions out there, and I think people enjoy it. I think it's something that people actually probably want to hear a little more than the recaps.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be a nice compliment to sort of tie things in every week. Talking, because one of the things that we like to do on this show is talk about how races were supposed to develop, what we thought about beforehand, and then talk about how they actually transpired on the racetrack. And I think it'll just be a nice compliment to tie those two things together. And I don't think it's going to be the sort of thing where we're just giving out straight picks every week. We'll probably just try to have a conversation about these races, and we'll look at the big days, cards with multiple stakes races, big races from around the country, not just in New York and California. And we'll just try to put some opinions out there and try to put forth some good ideas. And then we'll recap and see how we did on the typical recap show every Tuesday, which will continue to be put out every week. So 2 podcasts a week moving forward. And you can expect that to begin in about 2 weeks. Craig, as always, great to talk about the races with you. And you can always check out our TimeformUS Pacecast on drf.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or SoundCloud, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Forum and listen to the TimeformUS Pacecast. So thanks for listening, guys, and we'll be back at you in 2 weeks with a preview show and our typical recap show. See you then.